Many pals still remember the madness of those men on April 7–8, 1952. Ran Hunter said that during that night, as far as he knew, 99 people were killed and 300 had their flesh and hearts cut. In the end, the screening result obtained by the United States was that 14,000 prisoners of war claimed to go to Taiwan voluntarily. Volunteer prisoners of war waving the blue sky and white sun flag and shouting back to Taiwan, data map, 1. Volunteer prisoners of war waving the blue sky and white sun flag and shouting back to Taiwan, data map. At 9 a.m. on January 20, 1954, Ran Huntu, a former prisoner of the 600th Regiment of the 200th Division of the 67th Volunteer Army, mixed with 14,220 prisoners of war waving the blue sky and white sun flag and shouting "Go back to Taiwan," and left the United Nations Army near Panmunjom, North Korea. Powcam. The Taiwan delegation, carrying huge photos of Sun Yat-sen and Chiang Kai-shek, greeted them and extended a warm welcome to the prisoners of war. According to sources, prisoners of war paid tribute to the photos of Sun and John. Escorted by the 8th Army of the U.S. Army, 530 trucks transported the prisoners to Incheon. Here, they transferred to 15 U.S. transport ships to Taiwan, and the U.S. 7th Fleet and the U.S. Air Force 5th Army accompanied them for protection. After drifting at sea for 88 hours, they arrived at their destination Taiwan Keelung Port. Another 142 seriously injured and sick people were first sent directly to Taipei by military plane for treatment. Careful people noticed that Zhang Jingguo, who was standing on the shore leading the welcome crowd, was wiping tears from his eyes. As the KMT's de facto director of military intelligence, he has completed a mission to affect the fate of Taiwan. Equally excited was Chiang Kai-shek. On January 23, a 67-year-old man, who suffered from insomnia after being defeated in Taipei, slept peacefully for 9 hours after receiving reports that wounded and sick prisoners of war had arrived in Taiwan safely by military plane. The next day, he wrote in his diary, "This is actually the most peaceful night of sleep this year." In his diary, Chiang Kai-shek called this event a major victory in the spiritual struggle against Russia in the past 5 years. Turning point of fate. Chang Chen, an expert on volunteer prisoners of war and a PHS crash. On January 5, 1950, U.S. President Truman officially announced that the U.S. would adopt a policy of non-interference in the Chinese Civil War and would not provide military aid or military advisors to Taiwan. On the same day, U.S. Secretary of State Atkinson, who insisted that Taiwan has never been of great strategic importance, emphasized that the U.S. will continue to supply the fertilizers needed on the island of Taiwan and advance rural reconstruction projects, but any further increase in military aid and military advisors are unnecessary. After the Kuomintang regime lost the mainland, Taiwan became an abandoned child in the game between China and the United States, and is facing the desperate situation of collapse and being eliminated. Chiang Kai-shek even declared publicly in despair, "The representatives of our government will be expelled from the international community," and this has become a foregone conclusion. On May 17, 1950, the U.S. Embassy's charge d'affaires, Shuin, said, "Taiwan's fate is a foregone conclusion. The CCP will attack Taiwan from June 15 to July." 5 days later, the U.S. government issued an evacuation order. All Americans should evacuate Taiwan as soon as possible. This follows Atchison's March 7 letter to Secretary of Defense Lewis Johnson seeking to prevent the shipment of 25 M4 Sherman tanks and 25 F-80 fighter jets to Taiwan, even though the Kuomintang had paid for them, yes, but this batch of equipment may fall into the hands of the Chinese Communists. No one doubts the speed at which the nascent Red regime will attack Taiwan. Americans believe that Beijing will acquire Taiwan before the end of 1950, that Beijing will become the only government representing China, and that the United States will then recognize Beijing's CCP regime, said John W. Spanier, a professor at the University of Florida. The relationship between the United States and the Kuomintang Chiang Kai-shek for many years will also come to an end with Taiwan changing hands. The Kuomintang regime, which is located in the southeast corner, seems to be precarious, and the fate of the instant collapse seems irreversible. However, on June 25, 1950, the Korean War broke out. The desperate Chiang Kai-shek saw a glimmer of hope. The next day, Chiang Kai-shek expressed to MacArthur that he was willing to provide 33,000 soldiers to fight in South Korea. The situation in the Far East changed suddenly. The U.S. Far East strategy also changed accordingly. On June 27, U.S. President Truman stated that the possible occupation of Taiwan by communist forces will directly threaten the safety of the Pacific region and the safety of U.S. forces performing legitimate and necessary tasks in the region, and decided to send the 7th Fleet across the Taiwan Strait. Chiang Kai-shek sent Gu Weihun and He Shili to challenge MacArthur again and again. Soon, Chiang Kai-shek proposed that 15,000 volunteers could be sent to fight, and they would be completely under the command of MacArthur. In the December 31, 1950 diary, Chiang Kai-shek wrote, "God bestowed the Korean War, and we should thank God the most, for making the United States stand up to the communists and not abandon the Far East, so as to divert the entire situation." Although the direct dispatch of troops failed, Taiwan still provided the UN Army with urgently needed civilian personnel such as translators, Chinese teachers, and journalists. It was these hundreds of Kuomintang agents disguised as civilian employees who successfully instigated more than 14,000 volunteer prisoners of war while providing a large amount of information to Taiwan. Instigate a hidden war. It was Lai Mingtang, director of the 2nd Department of Taiwan's Ministry of National Defense, who first proposed the idea of instigating prisoners of war against the Communist Party to come to Taiwan. After the idea was put forward on July 7, 1951, Taiwan's Ministry of National Defense held a meeting of various departments and bureaus on August 9, 1951, and approved the plan. Ran Hungtu didn't know that from that moment on, they were no longer ordinary prisoners of war who could be released home after the war. They had been placed on the chessboard of various political forces in the Far East and became crucial pieces. During the first armistice negotiations that began on July 11, 1951, North Korean Representative Nam Il proposed the exchange of prisoners of war. On July 25, Taiwan's embassy in South Korea sent back a secret telegram saying, "The captives collectively knelt down and begged for an interpreter." Dr. Chang Chen interviewed many prisoners of war on this matter, and what he learned was that the United States sent troops hastily at the beginning of the war, and was not mentally prepared to fight the Chinese army. Some Japanese and Koreans who had lived in China and could speak Chinese were recruited as translators, which caused serious communication barriers between Chinese prisoners of war and American and Korean soldiers. This matter just became an opportunity for Taiwan to send a large number of spies to intervene in the Korean War process. On November 6, Taiwan's embassy in South Korea sent a confidential message to Taipei, confirming that Taiwanese agents had entered the prisoner of war camp at that time and passed information to the rear. The secret telegram relayed a report by an interpreter, saying that in late September, 96 people including Zhang Sibo from the 72nd and 86th wings of the prisoner of war camp on Geoch Island automatically organized the Anti-Communist Anti-Russian League and requested to have the Anti-Communist Anti-Russian 4 character. Zhao Yinkui, a prisoner of war, recalled that before entering the prisoner of war camp on Jeju Island, among the more than 10,000 volunteer prisoners of war, a group of fake prisoners infiltrated from Taiwan had quietly mixed in. About 400 people were the son of Huang Baidao, the general who died in the Kuomintang army. Huang Xiaoxian was among them. They were quickly appointed as regimental captains, large captains, small captains, squad leaders and other titles, and became managers of prisoners of war. Chang Cheng said that some former soldiers of the Kuomintang should be the first to change their positions. Taiwanese political workers explained the 3 principles of the people and anti-Soviet and anti-communist theories to the prisoners of war, while they connected and instigated them in private, using soft and hard tactics, and forcibly tattooed the words anti-communist and anti-Russia on the chests and arms of prisoners who refused to change their positions. This is to cut off our way back to the country. Zhang Xi, a prisoner of war who returned to the mainland after the war, said, "After being tattooed, many people despaired. After that, a group of CCP political cadres changed their positions. Moreover, this group of traitorous political cadres worked harder than the Taiwanese to instigate rebellion against prisoners of war." Chen Cheng analyzed that they are incomparably familiar with the CCP's strict organization and military discipline. As the implementers of organizational discipline and policy preachers in the past, they are very clear about what will happen after returning to China with the tattoo of anti-communist and anti-Russian. However, according to Article 118 of the Geneva Convention, after the cessation of actual fighting, prisoners of war shall be released and repatriated without delay, and they should still be repatriated to mainland China eventually. If the defectors want to change their destiny, they must coerce more people into a massive momentum and force the US to change its policy. For this reason, they did not hesitate to violently confront or even brutally kill comrades who insisted on refusing to be transformed. In the spring of 1952, Zhao Yingkui witnessed with his own eyes that 2 prisoners of war who refused to accept tattoos were beaten to death with a nail drill used to fix the tent. Ran Hungtu said that some prisoners of war who refused to cooperate were stuck with their mouths covered in the toilet and murdered as soon as it got dark. The spoiler. Initially, the US government was not willing to send prisoners of war to Taiwan. On August 27, 1951, Atkinson stated that the overriding consideration should be to bring back all UN and Korean prisoners as soon as possible. The interests of the United States require us to strictly abide by the Geneva Convention. On November 15, the U.S. Joint Chiefs of Staff issued a directive to Ridgway, in order to return all or as many United Nations and Korean prisoners of war as possible, or to avoid unacceptable delays, or to prevent the collapse of armistice negotiations. If necessary, you have the right to agree to a full exchange of prisoners of war. At that time, the attitudes of China and the Soviet Union were clear and consistent. Mao Zedong called Stalin, "I oppose the exchange on the one-to-one basis. We suggest that the exchange be based on the principle of repatriation of all prisoners of war by both sides." Stalin replied, "Your position is completely correct, and it is difficult for the enemy to raise objections. The positions of the negotiating parties are close, and it seems logical to repatriate prisoners of war in accordance with the Geneva Convention." However, no one expected that Little Taiwan would immediately become a spoiler. On December 18, 1951, Taiwan's Minister of Foreign Affairs Ye Gongchao said in a statement, "Many of the Chinese prisoners of war currently in the hands of the coalition forces in the Korean border have strongly expressed their unwillingness to return to the Iron Curtain. In the sense of freedom, the CCP and North Korean prisoners of war are forced to be sent to the hands of the communist tyranny, which is neither democratic nor Christianity." Judging from the instruction issued by the Joint Chiefs of Staff to Ridgway on January 15, 1952, the statement of the Taiwan authorities has undoubtedly influenced the attitude of the U.S. government. As a final position, you are authorized to agree to exchange all prisoners of war, but you cannot force return by force. In the following months, the position of the U.S. side vacillated between voluntary repatriation and full repatriation. On February 14, 1952, Admiral Joey, the chief negotiator of the United Nations Army, called the Joint Chiefs of Staff, saying, "Any unilateral screening by the United Nations Army in the hope of creating a fait accompli to solve the problem of forced repatriation will constitute a U.S. breach of trust, and will inevitably lead to retaliation by the Communist Party against our prisoners of war." Ye Gongchao immediately notified the Associated Press on February 25. The Republic of China government will accept all surrendered captives who voluntarily come to Taiwan to participate in anti-communist and anti-Russian work, and who have been verified by the Allied forces to come to Taiwan. On February 27, the Joint Chiefs of Staff called Ridgway again, expressing the final position: the U.S. government will not forcibly repatriate prisoners of war. On the same day, U.S. Ambassador to South Korea Mucho called and said, "We know that our military has brought in a lot of Chinese, and their teams are distributed among translators and civic education school personnel. I personally have a feeling that the Chinese have influenced developments in Geoje Island and Panmunjom." Robert Achinelli, a professor at the University of Toronto in Canada, pointed out that despite the absolute reliance on Washington's support, the KMT government is far from being a submissive Cold War agent, and can have its own influence on the philosophy and operation of American politics. Switcher Chiang Kai-shek. In the following 2 months, Taiwan continued to emphasize on various occasions that prisoners of war who voluntarily come to Taiwan are acceptable. In the past, China and the Soviet Union insisted on repatriating all prisoners of war in accordance with the Geneva Convention. Later, Taiwan continued to create pressure from public opinion. The U.S. government, caught between the two positions, had to vacillate and debate repeatedly. Atkinson realized on February 8, 1951 that the issue of prisoners of war will become the only unresolved issue in the armistice negotiations. The U.S. government is eager to get rid of the burden of prisoners of war. On the Chinese side, due to the gradual disappearance of the unexpected strategic advantage at the beginning of the war, China's position on the issue of prisoners of war was also loosened for a time. On April 17, 1951, the Embassy of Taiwan in South Korea reported, representatives of the Chinese Communist Party indicated that they can accept the repatriation of more than 80% of the captives. So, on April 8, the United States began to reinvestigate and screen the willingness of the prisoners in the prisoner of war camp on Geoje Island. The U.S. hopes that there will be no coercive will, and that the 80% figure can be successfully reached, so as to reach a negotiation agreement as soon as possible and end the war. The day before the screening to determine the final fate of the prisoners of war began, Taiwanese agents and defectors also took active actions. Decades later, many prisoners of war still remember the madness of those men on April 7 to 8, 1952. Ran Hungtu said that in that night, as far as he knew, 99 people were brutally killed, and 300 people had their flesh and hearts cut. In his book Notes of Prisoners of War, Zhang Xi mentioned a prisoner of war named Li Dan. Wen Hua's chest, the still beating heart on the dagger, went everywhere to intimidate the prisoners of war. In the end, the screening result obtained by the U.S. side was that 14,000 prisoners of war claimed to go to Taiwan voluntarily. On May 7, 1952, Truman announced, "Forcibly repatriating prisoners is contrary to the basic moral and humanitarian principles of our operations in Korea. We will not place people in a situation where they will be slaughtered or enslaved in order to buy an armistice agreement." United States thus ended the vacillating POW position. China and the DPRK cannot accept this position of the U.S., and the Panmunjom armistice negotiations have reached a stalemate again. However, when the 180th Division of the Chinese Volunteer Army was hit hard in late May 1951, the situation changed. Taiwan, which did not directly participate in the war, effectively hijacked the agenda of the armistice negotiations. Dr. Chang Chen believed that it was precisely because of the influence of Kuomintang agents among the nearly 21,000 Chinese prisoners of war that the 3-year Korean War ended the last 2 years. The year has been dominated by political debate. If we regard the two superpowers and China as the locomotive driving the war, then Chiang Kai-shek is the switchman at the critical moment, effectively changing the course of the war and peace talks. The biggest winner who never fought the division of North Korea into South Korea was a foregone conclusion. Kim Il-sung, who was eager to end the state of war, loosened his position first, and only China, supported by Stalin, insisted on repatriating prisoners of war in accordance with the Geneva Convention. However, when Stalin passed away in 1953 and Khrushchev came to power, the Soviet Union no longer insisted on its previous position, which made it difficult for China to support itself. On July 27, 1953, the Korean War Armistice Agreement was signed, confirming that prisoners of war would be repatriated on a voluntary basis. So far, the matter of volunteer prisoners of war going to Taiwan has finally been settled. Since then, the Taiwan Kuomintang delegation has repeatedly mentioned the issue of prisoners of war going to Taiwan to the United Nations, in order to prove that the Chinese will definitely reject communism as long as they have a choice, and further prove the legitimacy of their political views. After the prisoners of war went to Taiwan to win the political initiative, the Taiwan authorities then signed the Taipei Treaty in 1952, formally returning Taiwan's sovereignty from Japan to China. In November 1952, after Eisenhower became the President of the United States, he adopted a more radical and tough Far East policy, and signed the Sino-US Mutual Defense Treaty with the Taiwan authorities in 1954, which marked Taiwan's reincorporation into the U.S. military alliance system. As a result, Taiwan has been guaranteed a living space for the next 20 years. Taiwan never participated in the war, but it became the biggest winner of the Korean War. Chang Chen believes. Chess pieces and discarded pieces. The Kuomintang regime in Taiwan got rid of the fate of abandoning its son. However, the volunteer army prisoners of war, the key pieces to help Taiwan complete the transformation of its destiny, became abandoned after realizing the value of use. After the Ran Hunkus went ashore, they took 225 large military trucks and divided them into 5 detachments, led by a motorcycle team, accompanied by ambulances and communication vehicles. In addition, there was a radio vehicle arranged by the Kuomintang to play songs and distribute leaflets along the way. After the convoy arrived in Taipei, they marched along the main streets, and people set off firecrackers along the way, creating a festive atmosphere. However, after the festive celebrations, Taiwan's promises such as prisoners of war can freely choose occupations after going to Taiwan, and those who refuse to go to Taiwan can choose to go to a neutral country have not been fulfilled. The prisoners of war were handed over to a mentoring organization under the leadership of Chiang Ching-kuo. After being reviewed one by one, they were added to the grassroots of the Kuomintang army. Ran Hungtu recalled that many people were actually unwilling to go to Taiwan. On the ship from South Korea to Taiwan, Some comrades said, "I will die if I go to Taiwan, and I will die if I go back to the mainland with tattoos." No hearing advice, he jumped into the sea as soon as he lowered his head. On August 28, 1958, the Kinmen artillery battle broke out. Ran Hungtu and other former volunteer prisoners of war also went to the front line, and some of them brought the rifles and automatic rifles of the American Devils, swam away with the guns, floated to Xiamen and escaped. Ran Hungtu also wanted to escape, but failed because the attempt was discovered early. The frequent escape incidents made the Kuomintang authorities realize that most of these volunteer prisoners of war were still people in Caoying and their hearts in Han, so they started a new political offensive against the prisoners of war. Ran Hungtu was once asked to join the Kuomintang, but he refused. The concepts of good guy, bad guy and Chinese have been entangled in Ran Hungtu's heart, and he can no longer give himself a definition. This veteran of many battles who was forcibly drafted into the army no longer cares about politics, but every year around the Qingming festival, he always faces the sea. "When I burn paper in Taiwan, I dream of my mother and my younger brother. At that time, as soon as I lay down on the bed, my foot pulled the trigger and the gun was pressed against my chest. I told them many times that I didn't commit suicide, I could only shed tears at night. I said I still want to live, come back and see, I have an explanation to my family." In the Spring Festival of 1942, he was tied up with a rope by the security chief and sent to the barracks. He couldn't help himself, and was involved in the turmoil of the times all his life. He never returned to his hometown for more than 60 years. He felt that he had never had the opportunity to choose his own life in this life. Peasants, Kuomintang Army, People's Liberation Army, prisoners of war, Kuomintang Army. It seems that the afternoon of arresting the strong man changed all his fate. He said he didn't know who to blame. When he retired in 1975, he was in his 50s, still a private with the rank of sergeant, alone. There is no news of the baby mother he made at home, but he still thinks about the woman he has only seen once day and night, because after the death of his parents, this woman has become Ran Hungtu's most vivid image of his hometown. At the end of 1987, the Taiwan authorities allowed Taiwan residents to visit relatives in the mainland. The 38-year isolation of compatriots on both sides of the strait was broken. However, Ran Hungtu was short of cash and had no support from relatives or friends, so he could only wash plastic bags to make money. He had no home, so he slept in the corner of the stairs at night. Ran Hungtu finally returned to his hometown. On March 29, 2008, he got off the plane in Chengdu and asked fellow villagers all the way, "The persimmon and orange trees in front of the old house are delicious, are the trees still there?" The fellow said that the orange tree is gone, but the persimmon and peach trees are still there. As a result, I went to see it, and the persimmon tree was as old as me. Ran Hungtu chose Yuchang as his home in his later years. This is the place where he fought during the anti-Japanese war. Today, Ran Hungtu and his nephew's family raise more than a dozen cows and live in seclusion in a small mountain village. For him, this may be a kind of comfort. He no longer needs to explain his complicated identity to others, and he no longer needs to argue about the right and wrong of those years. He said, "In Yuchang, if someone asks a question, they can simply answer that I beat Japanese devils here."